In the spring of 1824, a dying duke made an offer no respectable woman should accept. 6 months to live, one impossible demand, everything at stake. Thomas Warden, Duke of Kent, brilliant, wealthy, utterly alone, stood at death's door with consumption eating his lungs. His fortune? Destined for a nephew who'd destroy everything in months. His legacy? One. His solution? Scandalous. He needed a wife, not for love. He'd given up on that fairy tale decades ago. Not for companionship. What use is company when you're coughing blood? He needed a womb, an heir, a living child to cut his monster of a nephew from succession before death claimed him. Enter Victoria MacMillan, once an earl's daughter, now ruined, penniless, desperate. Her father's scandal had stolen everything: fortune, reputation, future. She survived on needlework, watching her blind, younger sister Isabella fade in a cold tenement. When the Duke's proposal arrived, marriage, conception, inheritance, most women would have fled. Victoria asked only one question: when do we start? This is not a love story, or is it? Because sometimes the coldest contracts birth the warmest hearts. Sometimes 6 months is enough. And sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the words, "This is purely business."
Hello everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, like the video and share with loved ones, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin.
In the spring of 1824, when England's rigid class divisions made crossing social boundaries nearly impossible, an extraordinary proposal was about to shatter every rule of propriety. This is a story about desperation, about impossible choices, and about how sometimes the coldest transactions can bloom into the warmest love. The question haunts us all: how far would you go to save someone you love? Victoria MacMillan was 24 years old and living in a nightmare dressed as ordinary life. The cramped London tenement room she shared with her younger sister Isabella smelled of damp and desperation. Her fingers, calloused and bleeding from endless needlework, moved mechanically across fabric by candlelight. Each stitch earned her pennies. Each day brought them closer to eviction. 3 years ago, she had been the daughter of an earl. She had worn silk gowns, attended balls, dreamed of a future bright with possibility. Then her father's gambling debts were exposed. The scandal erupted like wildfire through society. Within a week, he had put a pistol to his head in his study. Within a month, creditors had seized everything. Now Victoria sewed wealthy women's dresses while wearing rags herself. She watched her 16-year-old sister Isabella sit by the window, feeling sunlight she could not see. The childhood infection that took Isabella's sight could have been treated if they'd had money for a proper physician. That guilt sat like a stone in Victoria's chest. "Are we going to be all right?" Isabella asked one evening, her milky eyes turned toward Victoria's voice. Victoria lied. "Yes, darling, always." But the landlord had threatened eviction. They were 3 months behind on rent. The bread was running out. Winter was coming. 200 miles away in Kent, Duke Thomas Warden stood at his study window, watching his vast estate stretch toward the horizon. He was 38 years old and dying. Consumption had settled in his lungs like a tenant who refused to leave. Dr. Phil Osborne had been brutally clear: 6 months, perhaps less. Thomas coughed into his handkerchief. Blood stained the white linen. He folded it quickly, hiding the evidence, even though no one was watching. He had no wife. His brief marriage years ago had been loveless, ending when she died of fever. No children, no heirs, which meant everything he had built, everything his family had built for generations, would pass to his nephew, Jonathan Doherty. The thought made Thomas's jaw clench. Jonathan was a violent gambler who beat servants and drowned in debts. Within months of inheriting, he would sell off land, dismiss workers, destroy 200 years of careful stewardship. Hundreds of families depended on these estates. Jonathan would ruin them all. Thomas made a decision. If he had 6 months, he needed a wife immediately. Not for love, he had no time for romance. He needed a womb, an heir, a legitimate child to cut Jonathan from the line of succession. His solicitor investigated discreetly. "Find me a desperate gentlewoman," Thomas instructed. "Educated, young enough to conceive quickly, desperate enough to accept unusual terms. The report arrived within days. Victoria MacMillan, Earl's daughter, ruined by scandal, caring for blind sister, impoverished, loyal, intelligent, perfect. Thomas wrote a letter on heavy cream paper, sealed it with his ducal crest, and sent it by express rider to a shabby London address. When Victoria opened the envelope 3 days later, her hands trembled. The Duke of Kent requested her presence at Warden Manor. Urgent matter, private business. She looked at Isabella, then at their empty pantry. She had no idea her life was about to change forever. The journey to Kent took 6 hours in a hired coach Victoria could barely afford. She wore her only decent dress, navy blue and carefully mended. Isabella stayed behind with their neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher, clutching Victoria's hand before she left. "What does a duke want with you?" Isabella whispered. "I don't know, but if it helps us, I'll find out." Warden Manor rose from the Kent countryside like something from a dream. Stone walls, manicured gardens, windows glittering in afternoon sun. Victoria's throat tightened. She had once lived in such a place. Now she was a beggar approaching a palace. A stern housekeeper led her through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old money. They stopped at a dark oak door. The housekeeper knocked once, then opened it. "Miss MacMillan, Your Grace." Thomas Warden sat behind a massive mahogany desk. Victoria's first thought was that he looked like death barely postponed. Gaunt face, gray-tinged skin, dark circles carved deep beneath penetrating gray eyes. But his gaze was sharp, assessing her with the cold precision of a man making a business calculation. "Sit," not a request. Victoria sat, hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Thomas didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Miss MacMillan, I'm dying. Consumption. 6 months at most. I have no heirs. When I die, my nephew Jonathan Doherty inherits everything." He paused. "He's a violent gambler who will destroy these estates and ruin hundreds of families within months." Victoria's heart hammered. Why was he telling her this? "I need an heir, immediately. A legitimate son to cut Jonathan from succession." Thomas slid a document across the desk. "I'm proposing marriage. You will conceive a child. When I die, you inherit everything. The dukedom passes to our son. You become Dowager Duchess with full control of estates worth £200,000 and lifelong financial security." The air left Victoria's lungs. She stared at him, unable to speak. "This is a transaction, Miss MacMillan, nothing more. I need your womb. You need money. I'm offering you a way out of poverty in exchange for 6 months of your life." Victoria found her voice. "Why me? You're educated. Your father may have been a fool, but he ensured you could read and think. You're desperate enough to accept. And your father's scandal means no respectable marriage awaits you." His tone was clinical, brutal. "You need me as much as I need you." Victoria thought of Isabella's darkness, their eviction notice, the gnawing hunger, the cold London winter approaching. "I accept," she heard herself say, "but I have conditions." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Name them." "Immediate medical consultation for my sister's blindness. She lives here with us, and I want full education in estate management. Not as decoration, but as future administrator until our son reaches majority." "Done. I intended to teach you anyway. You'll need to protect what I'm leaving." He stood, extended his hand across the desk. "The wedding is in 1 week. No romance, no illusions. Pure business." Victoria stood, shook his hand. His grip was firm despite his illness. 1 week, she agreed. As she left Warden Manor, Victoria realized she had just sold herself. But she had also bought Isabella's survival. Sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. The wedding took place on a gray Thursday morning in the small chapel at Warden Manor. No flowers, no music, no guests beyond the required witnesses. Victoria wore the same navy dress she'd worn to the proposal. Thomas wore black, as though attending a funeral rather than a wedding. The vicar spoke of love and devotion with a voice that echoed hollowly in the empty chapel. Victoria barely heard the words. She felt numb, detached, watching herself from a distance as she spoke vows that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. "I do," Thomas said, his voice flat. "I do," Victoria whispered. No kiss, just a cold exchange of rings and the scratch of pen on marriage register. Isabella had arrived the day before, led gently through the manor by the housekeeper, Mrs. Beatrice. The girl's fingers traced walls and furniture, mapping her new home through touch. When Victoria found her that evening, Isabella was smiling. "It's warm here," she said simply, "and it smells like roses." The wedding night arrived with the inevitability of an execution. Thomas knocked on Victoria's chamber door at 10 o'clock. She opened it, heart pounding so hard she thought he must hear it. He entered carrying a single lamp, his face unreadable. "I won't pretend this is pleasant for either of us," he said quietly, "but it's necessary." Victoria lifted her chin, refusing to show fear. "Then let's not prolong the indignity." What followed was clinical, awkward, painful. Thomas was surprisingly gentle, apologizing when she flinched, but there was no tenderness. Just two bodies fulfilling a contract. When it ended, he sat on the bed's edge, not touching her. "I'm sorry this is your wedding night," he said finally. "You deserve better." Victoria pulled the sheet around herself. "We both did, but we're doing what we must." He looked at her then, really looked, and something flickered in those cold gray eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Respect for a woman bearing this with dignity he hadn't expected. "You're stronger than you know, Victoria." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The following days passed in uncomfortable silence. They lived as strangers under the same roof. Meals were formal, interactions brief. Thomas disappeared into his study for hours. Victoria explored the manor with Isabella, both sisters overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding their poverty. Then on the fourth day, Thomas made an announcement at dinner. "I've arranged for Dr. Osborne to examine your sister tomorrow. He believes surgery might restore partial vision. The cost is £500. It's already paid." Victoria's fork clattered to her plate. Why?" Thomas continued cutting his meat, not meeting her eyes. "Because your sister's suffering serves no purpose, and because you agreed to this arrangement partially for her sake. I'm not a monster, Victoria." She blinked back sudden tears. "Thank you." He glanced up, and for a moment the cold facade cracked. "Don't thank me. Just be there when she wakes. She'll need you." Victoria stared at her husband, this dying man who had bought her like property, and wondered if perhaps she had misjudged him. If this story is moving you, subscribe now, because what happens next will change everything between them, and you won't want to miss a moment. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Thomas summoned Victoria to his study after dinner. She entered hesitantly, expecting more cold instructions. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from his desk, where ledgers and documents lay spread like a feast. "If you're to manage these estates when I'm gone, you need to understand how they work," he said simply. "Sit. We begin tonight." The lessons became a nightly ritual. Thomas taught her accounting, crop rotations, tenant contracts, labor management. Victoria absorbed everything with a hunger that surprised them both. Her questions were sharp, intelligent, challenging his assumptions. One evening, reviewing a dispute between two tenant farmers over water rights, Victoria studied the maps and documents. "What if you redirected the stream here?" She traced a line with her finger. "Both properties would have access without conflict." Thomas stared at the map, then at her. "That's actually brilliant. I didn't see that solution." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Surprised a woman can think?" For the first time since their wedding, Thomas smiled. "Almost. Surprised anyone sees that angle. I'm genuinely impressed, Victoria." Something shifted in the air between them. Their conversations began expanding beyond business. Philosophy, literature, politics. Thomas discovered Victoria had read Mary Wollstonecraft's controversial writings on women's rights. He shared his own progressive views on workers' conditions, ideas that would scandalize most of his peers. "My first engagement was to a woman who wanted my title," Thomas admitted one late evening, firelight casting shadows across his gaunt face. "When I fell ill, she left within a week. Wrote a letter explaining she couldn't marry a dying man. I thought all women were mercenary after that." Victoria met his eyes. "And I thought all aristocrats were heartless. My father's peers abandoned us the moment scandal touched our name. Not one offered help when we were starving." She paused. Perhaps we were both wrong. Thomas reached across the desk, his hand covering hers briefly. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant. Perhaps we were. The household began noticing changes. The Duke laughed occasionally during dinner. The Duchess walked beside him through the gardens, their conversations animated. Mrs. Beatrice whispered to the cook that she'd never seen His Grace so engaged with anyone. But beneath the growing connection, Thomas's health deteriorated. His cough worsened. Blood appeared more frequently in his handkerchief, though he tried hiding it. Victoria noticed the way he gripped the desk when standing, the tremor in his hands, the increasing pallor. One night, as they studied estate maps by lamplight, Thomas suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Victoria with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "I'm grateful," he said quietly, "for this, for you. I expected this arrangement to be tolerable at best. Instead," he trailed off. "Instead," Victoria prompted, her heart beating faster. "Instead, these evenings have become the best part of my days. You're not just intelligent, Victoria. You're extraordinary." Victoria felt something warm unfold in her chest, something dangerous, something that felt dangerously like hope. "You're not what I expected either, Thomas." Their eyes held. Neither looked away. 2 months into their marriage, Victoria woke feeling nauseous. She barely made it to the wash basin before retching. For 3 mornings, the same pattern. Her courses hadn't come. Her breast felt tender, swollen. She knew. Dr. Osborne arrived that afternoon, examined her privately with Mrs. Beatrice present. When he emerged, his smile was genuine. "Congratulations, Your Grace. 6, perhaps 7 weeks along." Victoria found Thomas in the garden, sitting on a stone bench despite the autumn chill. His cough had been worse that morning. She approached slowly, her heart hammering. "Thomas." He looked up, saw her face, and stood quickly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. She took a breath. "I'm with child." For a moment, Thomas simply stared. Then his face crumpled. He pulled her into an embrace so tight she could feel his body trembling. His face pressed against her shoulder, and she realized with shock that he was crying. Silent tears, years of loneliness and fear finally breaking through. "Thank God," he whispered hoarsely. "Thank you, Victoria. Thank you." She held him, this proud, dying Duke, weeping in her arms, and felt her own tears fall. "You're welcome." When he pulled back, he cupped her face with both hands. "I need you to know something. You've become important to me. Not as," he struggled for words, "not as what I hired you for. As you, as Victoria, as the woman who sits with me every evening and makes me think and laugh and feel human again." Victoria's throat tightened. "You've become important to me too." "Is that terrifying for you?" he asked. "Because it terrifies me." "Yes," she admitted, "because this wasn't supposed to happen." "No," Thomas agreed. "It wasn't." 3 days later, Isabella's surgery took place. Victoria held her sister's hand as Dr. Osborne administered chloroform. The hours of waiting were agonizing. Thomas sat with Victoria in silence, his presence steady, reassuring. When Isabella finally woke, Dr. Osborne slowly removed the bandages. The girl blinked again. Tears streamed down her face. "I can see light," she whispered. "Shapes, I can see," Victoria sobbed, embracing her sister. Isabella's vision was partial, blurred, but after years of complete darkness, it was a miracle. She turned her head, focusing on Victoria's face. "You're beautiful," Isabella breathed. "I knew you would be, but seeing you—" Then Isabella looked past Victoria to where Thomas stood in the doorway. "And you must be my brother. Thank you. Thank you for giving me back the world." Thomas's eyes were wet. He nodded, unable to speak. That evening, Mrs. Beatrice remarked to the cook, "His Grace actually smiled at dinner. A real smile. I've worked here 15 years and never seen that." But Victoria noticed what the servants didn't. Thomas's hand shook, holding his wine glass. His cough that night was worse than ever. Blood stained his napkin. Time was running out, and they both knew it. By month 5, Thomas was bedridden more often than not. The consumption had accelerated, devouring him from the inside. Victoria sat beside him constantly, reading aloud from books of poetry and philosophy. Her pregnancy was visible now, a gentle curve beneath her dresses that Thomas would touch sometimes with wonder. Isabella brought fresh flowers daily, arranging them on Thomas's bedside table. She called him brother now, and he called her little sister. The affection between them was genuine, born from gratitude that had deepened into real familial love. One lucid evening, when the pain had temporarily receded, Thomas gripped Victoria's hand urgently. "Listen carefully. Jonathan will contest the will. He'll claim Edward isn't mine. Call you an opportunist who seduced a dying man." His voice was weak but determined. "I've prepared documents with lawyer Louise, ironclad, witnesses to the marriage, physicians' records documenting the timeline, everything. He cannot win, but he will try." "Don't talk about after," Victoria pleaded. "Not yet. There's no time for denial." Thomas pulled her closer. "You need to know something else, something I can't leave unsaid." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, I love you." The words came out raw, honest, stripped of all pretense. "I didn't mean to. This was supposed to be simple, a transaction. But you, Victoria, you made me feel human again. These months with you weren't dying, they were living. Maybe the only real living I've ever done." Victoria's composure shattered. "I love you too. I fought it. I didn't want to. But I do. I love you so much it hurts." They held each other, firelight flickering across the room, both crying for the time they'd never have. In the following days, Thomas taught Victoria final lessons about the estates, which tenants were reliable, which fields needed drainage, how to negotiate with merchants. He wrote letters for Edward, one for each birthday until the boy turned 18. "Tell him the truth," Thomas insisted. "Tell him our marriage started as a transaction but became real love. Tell him that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the truest endings." "I promise," Victoria whispered. One night, Thomas pulled her into bed beside him, not for consummation, but simply to hold her. They lay together, her pregnant belly pressed against his wasted frame, and he stroked her hair. "And you're going to be an extraordinary mother," he murmured, "and an even more extraordinary duchess. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." "I'll try." "No, promise me." His grip tightened. "Promise me you'll stand tall, that you'll protect our son and these estates and never let society make you feel less than you are." "I promise." Thomas kissed her forehead. "Thank you for these 6 months. Thank you for choosing life with me instead of mere survival." Outside, the first snow began to fall. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. The birth, the farewell, and the fall that will determine Edward's future are coming. You won't want to miss a single moment of this journey. Victoria's labor began a week early, in the dark hours before dawn. The first contraction woke her, sharp and unmistakable. She gripped the bedpost, breathing through the pain, and immediately thought of Thomas. He was barely conscious these days. Would he live long enough to meet their son? Mrs. Beatrice summoned Dr. Osborne. Isabella held Victoria's hand, whispering encouragement as the contractions intensified. 14 hours of agony followed. Victoria screamed, wept, begged for it to end, but through it all, one thought drove her forward. Stay alive, Thomas. Stay alive to meet him. At dawn, as golden light broke through the windows, Edward Thomas Warden entered the world. His cry was strong, indignant, full of life. Dr. Osborne placed the baby in Victoria's arms, and she laughed and sobbed simultaneously. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He's perfect." "Take him to his grace," Victoria commanded immediately, despite her exhaustion. Now, before, she couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Beatrice cleaned the baby quickly, wrapped him in soft blankets. Victoria, barely able to stand, insisted on walking to Thomas's chamber herself. Isabella and the housekeeper supported her on either side as she shuffled down the corridor, leaving a trail of blood. Thomas's room was dim, heavy with the smell of sickness and approaching death. He lay motionless, his breathing so shallow Victoria couldn't see his chest rise. "Thomas," she called softly, sitting on the bed's edge with great difficulty. "Thomas, he's here. Our son is here." His eyes opened slowly, clouded but still aware. Victoria placed Edward in his skeletal arms, supporting the baby's weight herself because Thomas no longer had the strength. Thomas looked down at the tiny face and tears streamed silently down his hollow cheeks. With tremendous effort, he touched Edward's cheek with one trembling finger. "Hello, my boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm your father. I won't be here long. But your mother, she's extraordinary. Listen to her. Always." Edward yawned, braced his dark eyes trying to focus on the face above him. Thomas looked at Victoria, his gray eyes holding hers. "Raise him kind. Raise him just. Teach him that titles mean nothing without character." "I will," Victoria promised through her tears. "I swear it." Thomas held his son for 5 precious minutes, memorizing every detail. Then his arms weakened. Victoria took Edward back, and Thomas's hand fell to the bed. "I died a happy man," he whispered, "because of you." Victoria stayed beside him, holding Edward with one arm while gripping Thomas's hand with the other. She didn't leave, even when Isabella begged her to rest. 3 days later, as snow fell thick and silent over Kent, Thomas Warden died in his sleep. Victoria held his hand until it went cold. Then she bent and kissed his forehead one final time. "Goodbye, my love. Thank you for seeing me." The funeral procession wound up the hill to the family cemetery. Victoria, still bleeding and weak from childbirth, watched from her window. The entire county attended. She saw the coffin carried by estate workers whose lives Thomas had protected. Isabella stood beside her, holding baby Edward, both of them crying. The war was about to begin. Jonathan Doherty contested the will within a week of Thomas's burial. His lawyer delivered the papers to Warden Manor with barely concealed satisfaction. "The child is a fraud," Jonathan declared to anyone who would listen at London clubs and society gatherings. "She seduced my dying uncle, probably got herself pregnant by some other man, and now claims the entire estate. It's obscene." The legal battle consumed 6 brutal months. Victoria, still recovering from the childbirth and grieving Thomas, faced attacks on every front. Jonathan's lawyers dug up her father's scandal, painted her as a desperate fortune hunter who had trapped a vulnerable dying man. "Miss MacMillan," Jonathan's lead counsel sneered during one hearing, "isn't it true you accepted this proposal purely for financial gain?" "Yes," Victoria answered clearly. "His Grace offered security. I offered an heir. It was a transaction both parties entered willingly and legally." The courtroom murmured. Victoria's honesty was unexpected, but she wasn't finished. Lawyer Louise presented physician testimony confirming conception dates. Marriage witnesses testified to the legitimacy of the ceremony. Thomas's personal letters written to Edward demonstrated his sound mind and deliberate planning. Then came the evidence that destroyed Jonathan's case entirely. Servant testimonies describing years of Jonathan's violence. A maid he'd beaten so severely she lost hearing in one ear. A stable boy he'd kicked unconscious. Police reports from 3 different counties documenting assaults. Gambling debts totaling over £15,000. Unpaid creditors who'd been threatened with violence. "This is the man," Louise addressed the court, "who claims moral superiority? Who accuses the Dowager Duchess of impropriety while his own character is demonstrated repeatedly to be violent, reckless, and cruel." The judge reviewed the mountain of documentation. Thomas had been thorough, meticulous. Every detail anticipated, every loophole closed. On a cold March morning, Victoria sat in the courtroom with 1-year-old Edward in her lap. The boy had Thomas's dark hair and her hazel eyes. He played with her necklace, oblivious to the proceedings determining his future. The judge cleared his throat. The marriage between Duke Thomas Warden and Victoria MacMillan was legal and properly witnessed. The child, Edward Thomas Warden, is legitimate and confirmed as heir by multiple testimonies and medical records. The Dowager Duchess will serve as regent and administrator of the estates until the young duke reaches his majority. He looked directly at Jonathan. "Mr. Doherty's claims are dismissed with prejudice. Any further frivolous contests will result in fines for bad faith litigation." The gavel fell. Victoria closed her eyes, holding Edward tight. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan was waiting. His face was twisted with rage. "You scheming whore, you think this is over?" Victoria stopped, looked him directly in the eye. Her voice was steady, cold. My husband saved these estates from you. I will die before I let you destroy his legacy. Come near me or my son again, and I will have you arrested. Good day, Mr. Doherty." She walked away, head high, Edward in her arms. Behind her, Jonathan's curses faded into nothing. She had won. But she was exhausted, grieving, and utterly alone with a massive responsibility. The real work was just beginning. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book Victoria had written herself. She was 29 now. Edward was 4 years old, a serious boy with his father's dark hair and thoughtful nature, but his mother's kind eyes and ready smile. He ran through the gardens of Warden Manor, laughing as Isabella chased him, her partial vision enough to navigate the familiar grounds. The Kent estates had transformed under Victoria's management. She'd modernized farming techniques, increasing yields while reducing labor hours. She built a school for tenants' children, hiring 2 teachers. Fair wages became standard. A medical dispensary opened, staffed by a physician who visited weekly. Other nobles began copying her methods. The Dowager Duchess of Kent became known not for scandal, but for innovation and compassion. Invitations arrived regularly, marriage proposals too, from widowers and ambitious younger sons. Victoria declined them all politely. On a spring morning that smelled of apple blossoms, Victoria and Edward walked to the family cemetery. They carried white flowers, as they did every year on the anniversary of Thomas's death. Edward placed his small bouquet on the gravestone carefully. "Is this my papa?" he asked, as he always did. "Yes, darling, Duke Thomas Warden, a great man who loved you before you were even born." "Tell me again," Edward said, settling onto the grass. Victoria sat beside him, smoothing his dark hair. "Your father was dying when we met. He needed an heir to protect these estates and all the families who depend on them. I needed help, so we made an agreement." "Like a business deal?" Edward asked with a child's blunt curiosity. "Exactly like that. But something unexpected happened. We became friends, then more than friends. We fell in love, even though we didn't have much time." "Do you miss him?" "Every day, but he's still here, Edward. In you, in these estates he protected, in every choice we make to be kind and just." Edward touched the gravestone. "I'll be a good duke, Mama, like Papa wanted." Victoria's eyes filled. "You already are, my love." That evening, in Thomas's old study that was now hers, Victoria opened the worn leather journal where she'd recorded their story. She'd filled it over the years, writing down everything so Edward would know the truth when he was old enough to understand. She wrote the final entry. "Life doesn't give us what we deserve. It gives us what it gives, and we choose what to do with it. I chose to turn a transaction into love, desperation into purpose, 6 months into eternity. Thomas saw me when I was invisible. He gave me not just security, but dignity, and I gave him the legacy he died to protect. I was enough. I always had been. I just needed someone to show me." To anyone reading this, love isn't always romance and grand gestures. Sometimes it's respect, partnership, choosing to honor someone even when it's hard. Thomas and I had 6 months, but we made them count, and that's all any of us can do, make the time we're given matter. Victoria closed the journal and looked out at the prosperous estates stretching toward the horizon. Edward's laughter drifted from the garden where Isabella played with him. The sun set over Kent, painting everything gold. A legacy secured, a love honored, a life well lived. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now. Share it with someone who needs to hear that love can bloom in the unlikeliest places, and that sometimes our greatest strength comes from choosing dignity in desperate circumstances. More stories like this are coming, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the transformative power of seeing and being seen. Don't miss what's next.
If you enjoyed this story, we appreciate you a whole lot and look forward to connecting with you as we build a community on this channel. Every day, we will put out more stories, so we need your support. Help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. You won't miss any new exciting videos. Check out the next video. You'll love it!